My name's Andy Birtwistle, and I'm a reader in film and sound at Canterbury Christ Church University, and I'm the director of the Centre for Practice-Based Research in the Arts. The title of the lecture was States of Matter, so it refers to solids, liquids and gases, and I'm using that as a metaphor, a way of getting at the thing that I'm interested in, which is issues of form as they relate to ideas of radical poetics in the arts, and also in terms of form in cinema. The starting point of the lecture is Saussure's course in general linguistics, and there are two things that I focused on in the performance lecture. One is, in the course in general linguistics, Saussure is thinking about what's knowable and what's unknowable. And he's focusing on language as that which is knowable, which is a kind of abstract construct. And all the other stuff to do with language, in particular speech and sound, he sort of pushes to one side, and he says that's kind of unknowable. We can only make sense of I think he calls them the facts of speech, through language, this kind of abstract model. So you've got this play between language, which is this kind of model of knowability, which is kind of stable and so on and so forth, versus all this other stuff, and particularly sound, which is an unknowable mass. And then the other thing that I use as a starting point for the performance lecture is the notion of difference. So again, I mean, it's very well known, it's the idea expressed in the course in general linguistics that in language there is only difference without positive terms. And following up that idea of difference through into my interest in modernist poetics. Now I think that idea of difference really is significant in people's understanding of modernism, or has been for many years at least. And that's the idea that modernism represents a kind of radical break. So we've got this inscription of difference. It's somehow different from what came before. There's also, at the level of form, I suppose, the idea of montage as a kind of very virtuous modernist form, which again makes clear this kind of inscription of difference. And what I try to do in the performance lecture is think about the relationship between montage and folding. And I think I see the notions of folding or blurring or blending has been kind of overlooked or dismissed as having no real kind of radical potential within the field of radical poetics. The lecture is organised around figures of montage and figures of folding. So one of the things that made me choose 35mm slides and 35mm slide projectors as the means to kind of perform the lecture. One of the things that made me choose that is this idea of I wanted to create a presentation that is fundamentally underpinned by this sense of montage. So I thought the 35mm projector gives you that sense. It's one slide followed by another slide, and the transition from one slide to the other is this clunk of the projector. So we got this idea of a kind of montage sequence in time, very much like, I don't know, Soviet montage in a sense, one shot after the other. But following up this idea of Soviet montage works in a kind of horizontal dimension, image to image, but there's also a kind of vertical dimension. And this was early on in the years of sound cinema, a way in which people thought about, what's an alternative to this sort of naturalistic use of sound, what's a more radical or artistic use of sound, and came up with this idea of vertical montage, where what we hear might not exactly illustrate what we see on the screen, or at least not in a naturalistic way, although it still might have some sort of meaningful relationship with it. So what I've got going on in at least the first part of the performance lecture is a series of slides, and then I'm reading the text that I've written, and the two things might not always work in a sort of naturalistic way. So I might not always be talking about the slide that's being projected. And the slides, I should say, are all found slides, and they're taken from educational sort of geography resources. So it's slides of rock formations, river formations, deserts and so on. And that's meant to echo this idea of states of matter. In the second half of the performance, I'm trying to move much more towards a folded form of presentation. So instead of cutting from one slide to the other, there's a simple dissolve from one slide to the other, a layering of images. And at the same time, what I'm doing on the reading is I'm using partly the text that I've written about cinema and sound and so on, partly the text that's taken from the booklets accompanying these educational slides. So it's text about rivers and mountains and deserts and how to organise an exploration and so on. And then starting to mix those two things together as well. And in addition to that, because I also make reference to visual music as a sort of form of audio-visual blurring, there are texts on audio-visual music mixed into that. As the lecture goes on, that stuff gets more and more mixed together. So that's how I perform the ideas that I'm thinking about. So there's a performance of montage, and there's also a performance of folding